Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Ash Jogalekar. He is in science and product development, science writing and communication specifically. We connected on Twitter. I was drawn in by your thoughts on the history of science, and then found out later that you had a relationship with Freeman Dyson, who I know only tangentially through the Dyson sphere. And so I think we're going to have a very good conversation about science and science fiction, and what will soon turn from science fiction into science. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, George. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So let's go into Freeman Dyson. For those of my listeners who don't know, Freeman Dyson is a physicist. I should probably let you do it, but I'll try to butcher it. He's a physicist who came up with the Dyson sphere, which is like a way for a spacefaring civilization to harness the energy of the sun and put something around it, which harnesses the energy and allows the civilization to then transcend to a new galaxy. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. So Freeman Dyson was a mathematical physicist, a mathematician, polymath really, one of the most creative thinkers of the 20th century, and just kind of known as much for his hard, rigorous science as for his far-out ideas, one of which is the Dyson sphere. And you got it right. It was the way he proposed it originally is that he said, well, all our the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is really based on listening to signals in our space. But what if a civilization doesn't want to do that? They don't want to give away their existence because they're too scared or something, right? And that totally makes sense. And he said that whatever else a civilization does, the one thing that they cannot avoid doing is generate heat and let it escape in the form of infrared radiation. No matter how smart you are, that's just the law of thermodynamics, right? You cannot help but generate entropy and heat. And so he said that even if someone did not want to communicate with us, we could actually find out about their existence based on the infrared signature that civilization would have. And then he thought about a way in which the civilization could harness all the energy from its parent sun, essentially by dismantling all the planets or most of the planets in its solar system. And what was crazy about that paper that was originally published in Science magazine in 1960 was that he gave pretty detailed calculations on, that showed that, this is not beyond the laws of physics. It's actually reasonable. It's feasible. And that's where the Dyson sphere came from. So I thought, that's kind of the hallmark of his thinking. It's like go far out, but then also ground your thinking in some pretty rigorous calculation.
Brilliant. He definitely has crazy wisdom.
Yeah.
Okay, so interesting. How would he dismantle the planets, like for the minerals specifically, for the minerals and for the for everything?
For the minerals, including, I mean, planets obviously have a lot of light elements like lithium and carbon and beryllium and boron, which are structurally very strong. So you can imagine creating a gigantic envelope of these elements, at a distance of 1 astronomical unit or 2 astronomical units. Today we could probably think of carbon nanotubes or graphene or something like that. But that was his whole idea. And then he even worked out the physics and figured out that it wouldn't really change the dynamics of the solar system, because you would think that dismantling a planet would throw the whole solar system into chaos, but he proved that that's not quite true. So, which is
okay.
boring.
And he never took psychedelics. Do you know if he took psychedelics?
No, and I would be very surprised. But he did, he did believe in what we call cognitive enhancement of sorts, but only in the sense of science fiction. He was a big fan of Olaf Stapledon, and what we call distributed intelligence, right? He was very much a proponent, at least enthusiastic about the idea that consciousness could be expanded all through the galaxy and then throughout the universe. And, it could turn into this kind of hive mind. And of course, some people who take psychedelics, they think of themselves as being very connected, right, very connected to everything. So in that sense, he knew about the idea, I think.
Brilliant. Okay. So back to the Dyson sphere. What is an astronomical unit?
One astronomical unit is the distance between the Earth and the sun, which I believe is about 100 million miles. So So that would be enough. That would encompass all the planets, all the way up to Earth effectively. And you could use
York.
Mercury and Venus, right?
See, and the Oort cloud is okay. Got it. So it's around Earth. Got it. So it protects Earth from extraterrestrials who have a bad actor, extraterrestrials, and so surrounds Earth with a giant metal sphere that allows us to continue having solar power, but protects us
More
from
efficient.
giving off our infrared signals from energy production.
Yeah. I mean, roughly, you will always release some heat into outer space. So people who are, sensitive, who have sensitive infrared equipment, they could probably detect it. But we would still keep most of it inside, which is a good thing.
Okay. Sensitive infrared. Okay. This is great. And so we have the Dyson sphere. Let's go into genetic engineering because I was checking with ChatGPT about his work and it said he had some interesting thoughts on genetic engineering. If you were to describe in a paragraph or so Freeman Dyson's understanding of genetic engineering and the future of it, what would it be?
Well, he was certainly very enthusiastic about genetic engineering and about biology as a whole. He said that 20th century was squarely the century of physics, and the 21st century is going to be the century of biology. And we certainly see that in many ways, whether it's funding, whether it's the crazy ideas that people are having for genetic enhancement. And one of his ideas was that, and I find this fascinating. He said, just like computers were miniaturized and became like a cottage industry, and you had hobbyists building computers at home, you would also have people growing their own genetically engineered organisms at home. And he imagined a future where kids would actually buy these kits, let's say from Amazon, and someone would grow like a pet lizard with exotic colors, or flowers that carnivorous plants that are catching insects. And I said, oh, they would just have a fun time. And of course, it would all need to be regulated much more than your average computer or laptop is, but still.
So how do we even regulate it? How do we even regulate genetic engineering?
That's a great question, right? I mean, people are already trying to do that with CRISPR and other technologies. And his take on it, which I agree, is that it's always easy to get overzealous about regulating these things and try to do too much. And I get the feeling that we see that a little bit in some of the efforts that are in place right now for regulating AI.
Yes.
But if you do that right at the beginning without even knowing the potential of
Exactly.
what these technologies can accomplish, then you're going to do too much and you're going to squelch innovation. So I think the way I think about it, Stuart, is that we need to let some of it play out, right?
Yes.
Even if it's a little risky,
I agree.
and kind of like see how it operates at a small scale, and then try to put some regulations in place. That makes more sense.
Yes, I agree. And this is what I like about what I learned from Freeman is that essentially he recognizes the power in these things, and he recognizes the importance that civilization somehow understands the power and regulates it. But as you said, he's not going to try to regulate it before it starts, because that's just like,
Exactly.
not only is it harmful for whichever country does that, because other people will do this stuff, and we don't live in a one world government. We're not going to have one UN. UN isn't going to stop, Argentina, for example, of doing what it has to do. And I'm in biology. I've been so fascinated by being here because I'm starting this AI whisperers group down here. It's a thriving WhatsApp group and meetup, and a lot of Argentines in there, and one of the Argentines in there who I'm going to interview for my Spanish podcast, Crazy Wisdom in Espanol. She works at a biotech company, and there's like 150 down here or more. And then also, if you what were you going to say?
Oh, that's impressive. I
Yeah.
didn't realize those many. Yeah.
Yep. And I'm going to go investigate that and understand like what's serious, what's not. But I've gone to the local university, UBA. I met this interesting bioinformatician, and we're going to do a podcast as well. And so that tied with the socioeconomic political revolution sort of thing that's going on here with the rise of Javier Milei and his political party,
Mhm.
Libertad Avanza. That rise represents a sort of very Austrian economics rise, somebody who's very, very solid in the Austrian economics, who's also now the president. And so regulation, there is going to be regulation. He actually kind of angered me a bit by regulating the cryptocurrency situation here in a way that I think is irresponsible. But in general, there is going to be regulation, but that regulation I feel is going to be much smarter than what I see happening in the United States, given our institutions sort of changing significantly. Do you have any ideas on that?
No, but that's very interesting to hear. I was just going to say that I think that's one of the most fun parts about seeing these technologies develop, which is that every country has a different set of political philosophies, and every country is going to let these technologies grow and play out in different ways. And that's going to be intimately linked to the political or cultural, social problems that they want to solve, right? One of the questions to ask is, if Argentina develops genetic engineering, what would be their top 3 problems to solve with it? Versus, let's say, Malaysia or Australia or India or China. Right? Everyone would use it for something different. And I think that's part of the reason why we shouldn't regulate it, because we first want to let that play out, see those diverse uses to which the technology is being put, and then maybe try to have a say in it.
I really like where this conversation is going, and because I'm pessimistic that the United States is going to actually figure this out. Like, even though we figured out regulation in the best ways from 1950, maybe even earlier, until I would say 2020, like we were the leaders in sort of intelligent regulation. If the internet had happened in China or Russia, the internet would not exist because the internet was it was a byproduct of intelligent regulation. And so I'm pessimistic about there. I'm very, very optimistic about Argentina. Let's see. I'm optimistic about India. What do you think?
Well, they certainly have a very pro-free market economy right now and a pro-business approach. So I'm hoping that more of this will happen there, because India traditionally has been hamstrung by a lot of bureaucracy and government regulation and red tape, right? And there certainly seems to be less of it now. So I'm hoping that there will be more biotechs and more genetic engineering happening in India, certainly more AI. They certainly have the pool of talent that might be needed to further these technologies. But if you don't mind, I thought of an analogy with nuclear power that I think has some really important lessons here, both sort of, good lessons and bad lessons, if you will. So if you don't mind, I just want to spend 2 minutes
go for
on
it.
that.
Yeah, let's do it.
So right after the time that nuclear energy was discovered, and unfortunately, the first use of nuclear energy was in the form of the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was not great. But there was this period of breathless excitement, right? They were extremely optimistic about nuclear power. Louis Strauss, who makes an appearance in the movie Oppenheimer, said that we would get electricity that's too cheap to meter. And, it didn't quite turn out that way, but it tells you the mood.
Could it have turned out that way if the environmental movement hadn't stuck itself in there? And I love the environment. I want to protect the environment. Yeah, go for it.
So that's the key question. I think you're asking the key question. But the other big question is, every technology, and this has happened with computers, we know that it really thrives when people can do a lot of trial and error with it. They can build different prototypes. They can they can invent new versions of it without regulation, obviously, right? That did happen for a brief period at the beginning of the nuclear age in the 1940s and 50s. But after that, both the government and the environmental groups kind of clamped down in opposite directions. The government kind of clamped down on forbidding a lot of experimentation. They froze a few reactor designs that were not necessarily the most efficient ones. And that also meant that there was no longer a free market of companies doing this. You had like big sort of giant companies like GE and a few other companies who were building reactors. But you never had the kind of startup environment for nuclear power that you had for computers and for biotech. And I know that Freeman Dyson himself lamented this in one of his essays. He says that we are no longer allowed to play with nuclear power the way people played with it back in the 50s, right? And I think that led it down the wrong path. And of course, with the environmental lobby and 3 Mile and so on, and those accidents were widely misunderstood. They never killed anyone, but there was a lot of fear.
Chernobyl is Chernobyl the only one that really wasn't misunderstood? That was a clear failure of safety that if Russia had a better system of regulation, what do you think about Chernobyl?
Absolutely. So they clearly had a flawed design. There's no doubt about that. But the bigger problem was the communist state,
Yeah.
which prevented information from going out as fast as it should have been, right? Even simple things like distributing like iodine pills to prevent thyroid cancer, that was not done on time because they wanted to keep everything secret. I mean, it also tells you why it's so important to have a liberal democratic tradition in which you don't keep things secret, right? But I think the other thing to realize about Chernobyl is that even Chernobyl was pretty bad. No one would dispute that. But even Chernobyl did not kill, a thousand as many people as air pollution from coal and fossil fuels does, right? So it still wasn't as bad in terms of the casualties.
And what about 3 Mile Island? What happened there? I'm sorry, not 3 Mile Island. The one in Japan.
Oh, Fukushima. So Fukushima was kind of a worst case scenario that nobody had actually planned. The problem was that they were planned for, they had planned for a tsunami or an earthquake, but they did not really plan for both of those things to happen at once. And so, unfortunately, not only was there what we call a loss of coolant, but the backup power generators also went down. And this was just very, very unfortunate. But again, if you look at the actual number of casualties from Fukushima, it's very small. That doesn't downplay the tragedy of what happened, but people need to put it in perspective.
Yeah, and clearly from what you said about the coal thing, which is clear, like coal is much more dangerous. It kills a lot more people.
Right, right.
Imagine our air if without coal,
that
so good. Our air,
right.
our air would be so good. Like,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you remember that study that was done maybe 10 years back by James Hansen? James Hansen is one of the fathers of climate change. I mean, he kind of raised the alarms in the 80s and 90s in a big way. And he was the one who became a proponent of nuclear power because he said that if you add up the deaths from coal pollution, it's something like 2 million, which is inconceivable from nuclear power, right? So even someone like him, and that's something that always gets me about the left-right divide in politics, which is that the left, which typically advocates for climate change solutions and policies, somehow curiously they seem to be against nuclear power, and I've never really understood that. I've written about it myself.
yeah, interesting. And now we're in an interesting time. And now that we're out of it, I'm glad for the switch that's happened in politics, which is that nobody knows what side they're on anymore. All the sides have combined in ways. Now you've got the right talking about corporatism,
Right.
whereas before the only people who talk about corporatism were left. So there's a really interesting opportunity here to find allies across the way, and I'm really excited. So what about the future of nuclear power? I know China is innovating quite hard with, what is it, thorium reactors?
Yeah, with thorium reactors, that's been on the list for a long time. Even in the US, I think things are changing for the better. You have more startups led by young people who are trying out different reactors, again, sort of playing with the technology the way people played with computers. But ultimately, again, it is going to depend on government regulation and the environmental lobby. And I get the feeling they're not yet quite ready for that. Obviously, they have invested a lot of their efforts in solar and geothermal and wind, but they need to really come around.
I just got a great idea. So one of the interesting things about Argentina is that it's one of the best places in the world to do business development. There's one reason, because I'm a foreigner. I am like outside of the traditional hierarchy. So if I were an Argentine, I wouldn't be able to break into certain circles because I would be whatever class I was. And so, but because I'm a foreigner, I'm somehow outside it. So there is that advantage. But also, Argentines are just very, very warm and welcoming and open to new ideas. And so the Malay administration is kind of easy to break into, to influence. And so I've got a few contacts. When the time is right, I want to interview Javier Malay in Spanish. So I'm thinking that a potential thing to do, I was thinking about this in terms of AI regulation, because I know that the United States may clamp down on it, may not. I know Europe is definitely going to clamp down on it. And I'm very hopeful that Argentina can be influenced to not clamp down on it immediately, do smart regulation. Now I have a plan for that. But I was just thinking, what happens if we got the same ability to play with nuclear power? How much does it cost? What are the startups that are playing around with it in the United States? Do you know any of the names off the top of your head?
So TerraPower is certainly one of the prominent ones. I believe it's based in Seattle.
Right.
There's one or two others that whose names I don't remember, but I mean, the capital investment is
Yep.
definitely a problem because obviously it's going to take a minimum of a few $100 million. But some of the new reactor designs, the small modular reactors, they're much smaller. And at least the lab innovation part of it, I don't think it costs as much.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely more encouraging than before, where you had to build a giant pilot plant just to prove kind of proof of concept.
What are the lab innovation parts?
Well, the lab innovation parts are really looking at how you can use some of, well, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but
Yeah.
one thing that I know is that they're looking at how you can recycle the waste,
Hmm.
because that kind of solves two problems. One is where to get rid of the waste, which has long been a rallying point for the environmentalists, for instance, and also just make the process much more efficient. And that's something that I know that TerraPower has invested in.
Okay, I'm gonna go find somebody from TerraPower to go do an interview with. Nuclear power. Let's see. So what do you think is the future? So say that we are, I imagine that both of our desires come true, that nuclear power becomes our main, backup generation, that our whole cities are allowed to have a sustainable form of power that doesn't go down. The other piece for me would be solar power, I think, as the sort of at the outskirts of the grid or whatever. What do you think about the future energy makeup with nuclear power as the base?
I think that would be a perfect combination. So use solar power when baseline load is not a problem, when the sun is always shining. Use wind power responsibly. One of the funny things about wind power is how much land it takes,
Yeah.
and how much environmental damage it can actually cause if not done right. That's something that you don't always hear about.
Yeah.
But I certainly see a situation like France where, we're getting 70, 80% of our electricity from nuclear power, and the rest is supplied by solar and wind.
Is
Certainly
France
feasible.
changing it? Is France, because Germany said no more. Like, is France changing it? Is France
France,
changing it? They're still
France is
going
still,
strong.
yeah, they're still strong. Yeah, they're very French in that way.
I love the French. They're
Yeah,
like the Americans in the sense that like they just don't give a fuck. And so
right. And
uh,
I'm sure you know this. I just, this is one of the ironies of the people who oppose nuclear power, that Germany obviously shut down all its nuclear plants, and then it had to start importing nuclear electricity from France to make up for the deficit. So they're still using electricity from nuclear power, just not their own.
so crazy. It's so weird how how it works. Okay, anything else in nuclear power you want to draw attention to or that excites you?
Well, so there's this whole idea again, since we were talking about Dyson, about nuclear propulsion, right?
Ooh.
And that is one of the craziest projects that he worked on, which was called Project Orion, which was to build a nuclear, not just a nuclear powered spaceship, but a spaceship powered by falling nuclear bombs. I mean, it's about as crazy as you can imagine. So the idea was that it would go up some way into the atmosphere, drop a nuclear bomb, and then propel itself by the sheer force of the bomb's explosion. And then it would drop another bomb, and it would like keep on dropping these bombs at intervals, and it would propel itself at very high speeds compared to conventional rocketry. And it was, it seemed very feasible. I mean, they had drawn up the plans, they had done all the detailed calculations, and there was no physical principle that showed that it wouldn't work. The problem was that you would just
Create a heat
release
trail
a lot of fallout. Yeah, leave a trail of poisonous nuclear,
across
nuclear
space.
fallout. Yeah, in
But
space
but
and
it would just
everywhere.
stay there. It would just stay. No, it would if the bomb went off and then it would explode and then not stop until it hit a star or it hit a
Well,
planet.
hit a planet. I mean, you could steer it responsibly, of course,
Oh,
but yeah. So the idea was, they were working on this. They were working on this in 1958 or 1959, and they believed they could get to Saturn by 1970 in 10 years if they actually built this thing. And I mean, I think it's still feasible. I mean, of course, you can't seed the Earth with radioactive fallout, but once you're far out into
it's
space,
yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
could probably be diluted enough, right? And so I think that's going to be one of the more creative uses of nuclear energy once we need to escape this planet, because
I
it's,
don't think the environmental
oh, they're
environmental
not going to like that. Yeah.
interesting. So do you know how far we have to go outside of the Earth in order to explode our first nuclear bomb in order to propel us further?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the problem, of course, is anywhere in the solar system, and you're probably going to send the radioactive fallout either to Earth or some other planet, right? So we'll probably need to be out of the solar system. Just
Well,
naive
out of the
about it.
solar system, got it. So
Yeah.
it'd take us like 10 years to get through normal propulsion until, so it would still not solve the inter solar system, intra solar system problem of like whoever
Right.
goes is going to spend their life out there.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just that knowing the intrinsic limitations of chemical propulsion, notwithstanding what Elon Musk is doing with SpaceX,
Yeah.
there's really no other way to get to that level of energy generation for transport.
Because then once you're up to that speed, then you can maintain that speed until you need to slow down.
Yeah, correct. Law of inertia, right? Just
Yeah,
basic physics, and you just keep on going.
what was his theory on how to slow down?
Oh, I mean, you would obviously, well, you could
Go around
slow down.
You could go around the sun or go around the other
You go
planet.
around the sun, and honestly, slowing down in the vacuum of space,
And the problem.
it doesn't take a lot of energy. I mean, you can do it with chemical propellants, right? So you could have more conventional means of slowing down. It's really the getting to the high speed that's in the first place where you have to accelerate.
And
That's the hard part.
And then, so as you're building up with the nuclear propulsion, everybody would need to be strapped in because there would be an effect of that, right? That it would be quite violent. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the impulse, the thrust would be very high. So a lot of the calculations actually related to the pusher plate that's going to be pushed by the explosion and how to make it frictionless enough. There's like a pusher plate that actually goes and it kind of bumps against the rocket. And so that was exactly a big problem. I mean, if you didn't really make it frictionless, human bodies would disintegrate at that impulse, at that thrust,
I
right?
wanted to know. Okay, interesting.
But
So there's got to be a system for distributing the friction.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah, that's a large part of what they did.
Well, that's interesting. That's definitely a new thought for me. And what do you think our chances of getting to Mars are? And what do you think about once we get there? Because it takes 8 years to get there from the US, right? I'm sorry, from the US, from the Earth.
Yeah. Roughly. Yeah, that's right.
8 years. Okay. So it takes 8 years there, 8 years back. But then, yeah, we wouldn't be able to explode any nuclear bombs on the way to Mars. So whoever goes there would be looking at at least a 30-year journey, probably signing up for life on Mars.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people need to realize that all of these experiments and plans really need to transcend our ideas of what human lifetimes are, right? And we really have to be in it for the long haul. And I do think that there's a pretty significant psychological adjustment that we need to do in order to think that way, right? And we are just not used to doing that.
Which is it's almost the same thing. It's probably a little bit different than setting off from Europe. Well, for Columbus, it was maybe it was that crossed his mind that he's just never going to come back. But no, back in the day, not only the children were dying, but like after 2 years old, before 2 years old, they were all dying like flies, basically. And also the risk of getting on a ship, I'm imagining, was pretty high. I wonder what the death rate of getting on a ship was back in the 1500s. But yeah, if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, pretty bad. And you probably remember this, but the first wave of pilgrims, when they came to Plymouth, I think in the first year, 50% of them died.
Yeah.
So it was pretty bad. And I mean,
everybody knew that they were.
Everybody knew.
Yeah. And so the same mentality will have to be brought. Would you do it? Would you go to Mars if you had the opportunity?
I think I would. And I want to make the general point that this is something I've been thinking about, which is that paradoxically, the more we have improved our chances of living a long life, and the more we have reduced mortality, the more scared we have become of dying, right? And I'm never going to say, let's go back to the good old days when, 6 out of 10 people around you died, and that's why you were comfortable with the idea of dying. I'm not saying that. But I do think that that's why I talked about that psychological adjustment that we have to do to imagine a situation in which we go somewhere and never come back and just die in uncertain times and location, right?
Which could happen any day. It's just the chances of it. This
That's
gets
right.
good territory of statistics. And I took one statistics class that really back in UCSB that really made me finally get it, why statistics are so important. The one thing that was burned into my mind was the 2,000 person sample size that you need to have in order to get statistically significant results. But I'm not a mathematician at all. I'm really actually. This is a personal question, but do you know anybody? Do you know any math tutors who are also happen to be sort of psychologists? Anybody come to mind?
I'll have to think about that. Not
Yeah,
not
okay.
on the top.
I'll
Yeah.
send you an email later.
Seems like a good combination of skills to have.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, exactly. Because all my math teachers back in the day were not that good at that. And so where was I? Statistics. Proportion, the change in death chances of death, how that influences psychologically, knowing that, and it's subconsciously knowing that it's less likely to die makes us somehow more scared of death.
Mhm.
And which gets me into thinking about statistics in general, and the wild thing that's happened in the last few years about AI, machine learning, how LLMs are. I believe one term I heard in relation to it are stochastic
Stochastic.
parrots. Parrots.
Stochastic parrot.
Yeah, a stochastic parrot. It's just, and in some ways, human beings are also a little bit of a stochastic parrot as well. There's so much. Oh yeah, this gets into quantum mechanics. So my understanding, I've been reading this great book from about William Shockley, the inventor of the semiconductor.
Mhm.
And in that book, it gives a very clear definition, or not a definition, very, very clear explanation of the particular quantum mechanics that allowed for the invention of the semiconductor around electrons. And so for my listeners, I'll try to reproduce it. Basically, we have the atom, and then we have the electrons that are revolving around the atom like planets, except that model is not true. They're not revolving around the planets. They are in some sort of indeterminate probabilistic location around the atom that only solidifies once we observe the atom or observe the electron. And Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and he didn't believe that all the people who came up with the ideas about how to do it. And so the fact that it's some layer of reality is probabilistic rather than deterministic basically confuses the last 300 400 years of evolution, or of thought in the Enlightenment, which was the universe is deterministic. Like all these planets out there, those are all deterministic. Like there is no God. And then quantum mechanics comes and just like dirties the whole picture, and it's probabilistic. What do you think about this? Is my representation accurate? If not, how could I improve it? And then, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, largely what you're saying is very accurate. The one thing I would say is that the Schrodinger equation, which is at the heart of quantum mechanics,
Mm.
is actually deterministic in the sense that it gives you a well-defined set of probabilities. So even
Ah,
if it's probabilistic, those probabilities are well-defined, right? So it's kind of like this weird, it's like deterministic probability, if you want to call it that, effectively. So, when I do an experiment on a molecular or an atomic system, I know exactly what the probabilities of that experiment, the result are going to be. I know the distribution. I know that the electron is going to be here 70% of the time, there 20% of the time, right? So
oh,
it's not as bad as people think.
okay,
But
interesting. This takes at the New Age thing, and I'd love to get your opinion on this. So the I love the New Age. New Age descends from a thought called New Thought, and New Thought was popularized by Carnegie, not the robber baron, but the guy who wrote the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's
yeah,
essentially a new type of thought that if you just think hard enough about a particular goal, you'll get there. And then New Thought combined with a whole bunch of Indian spirituality, a whole bunch of other stuff, and created in the 1960s the New Age, all based on the Aquarian prophecy that we're entering the age of Aquarius, things are going to change. And so they took quantum mechanics and ran with it, and like created some really far out there ideas about what quantum mechanics does. And I've been trying to figure out like what is real, what is not real. There's got to be some parts that are real. And what you just told me is really interesting because it means that there still is determinism. So it's not
Yeah.
like, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and along those lines, I would add, in case you haven't read it, there's a fascinating book called "How the Hippies Saved Physics." Have you
Great.
heard about that?
No.
So it's written by this great historian of science and physicist David Kaiser, and it basically talks about how there was a bunch of hippies in the 60s and 70s who were kind of physicists who could not find jobs because the 70s especially were pretty bad for people who wanted to, academics who wanted to get jobs. And so they don't, they kind of really embrace this new age mysticism and new age enlightenment. What's interesting in the book is that some of the wacky ideas they came up with actually made it into the mainstream of physics, including some ideas that are related to the Nobel Prize winning work done by a few scientists. I think it was 2 years ago that they won the Nobel Prize, which is, work done on what's called quantum entanglement. And so, people made a lot of fun of those people because Fritjof Capra, he wrote this book, the Tower of Physics, right? And it's a very interesting book. But people said, well, the problem with this book is it enlightens neither religious people nor physicists. So, and it confuses both of them. But the fact is that some good did come out of that far out thinking. And that's why, you should, I always think you should always have a small critical mass of people who are doing all kinds of wacky thinking and far out thinking. Right? Something always comes out of it.
Yeah, we need fringe, more fringe, not too
More
fringe. There is a problem
Right.
with being too fringe. So do you remember the Nobel work done? Do you know who those scientists were called? What their names are?
Yeah, so um, Stuart Friedman, John Clauser, and Elaine Aspect, who is French, they were the ones who did most of that work. And it's fascinating. They essentially found out that whatever Einstein was saying, spooky action at a distance, is actually a feature of reality. It's not an anomaly. That's just the way the world works.
This is a feature, great. Okay, so I'm gonna go track them down, see if they can do interviews with them. Okay, let's go back to my notes that we were talking about, all of the different stuff we talked about. What's important in science communication? Who are your favorite science writers, and what lessons can we learn from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Freeman Dyson, of course, was an exemplary science writer. I think he really was a master at elegant prose and at simplifying concepts. James Gleick is another great science writer. It depends partly on your taste. My tastes tend to run toward the more literary science writers. So people like James Gleick, Richard Rhodes, Freeman Dyson, they're very good. Steven Weinberg is someone I really look up to when it comes to science writing. And the reason for that is that I think he was one of those people who never, ever talked down to the audience. And I think that's a very important thing about science writing. It's to realize that your audience is at least as smart, if not smarter than you are. The only difference is that you might have studied a field more extensively than them, right? And that's how you communicate. I think that's very important.
I'm gonna go check out his work. So this is something interesting. So about 10 years ago, I started to realize that the main use that I could use social media was for learning and putting out what I think, getting feedback, understanding where I was wrong, where I was right, but I ended up pissing off people. That one was really important to learn. And so about 3 years ago, I started using Twitter in that way. Maybe 4 years ago, I started using Twitter in that way. And so I built up these large stable threads now which are mostly gone because Elon Musk changed the algorithm and no longer people no longer see them. So there's no reason to do them basically. And so what was I going to say? Oh yeah. So I started to get into this dilemma of I'm studying this technical stuff and I'm sharing this technical stuff, and I've got an audience who likes some of what I write about, and then gets totally just kind of like doesn't like the fact that I'm going these rabbit holes that are totally like obscure. But one thing I learned in that process was that it's really fun to actually share the technical details as long as you explain yourself and you communicate it. You communicate to different audiences who don't have the understanding, don't know the jargon, and all that different stuff. And then I started to realizing that I really like communicators who don't hold back. They give you the technical details, they explain the technical details, and John Vervaeke is one of those people who I really like. He's not so much inside the science stuff, although he does cognitive science. I would put him more in the humanities, but keen understanding of the scientific method. And how to apply that to the cognitive stuff, even though this could be a fun conversation to go into now about consciousness and like spirituality and psychology, these things that are less science, more something else. Yeah, what do you think about it, what I just said? Where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, like you said, consciousness could be a whole new conversation in its own, right? But in general, what I'll say in a broad sense is that science as we know it rests upon a set of well-defined protocols, right?
Ooh.
And it has worked spectacularly well. No one will dispute that. But that does not necessarily mean that there aren't other protocols that can also potentially work. And I'm not talking about religion directly or, spirituality, but I'm just saying that it's always worth it to explore kind of the fringes of those protocols, right? Mm-hmm. So even statistics, I mean, we know that we need a certain sample size, as you pointed out, to have statistical significance. Does that mean that with smaller sample sizes, you just completely discard the results? Does that mean that the results are completely useless? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. And so I think, we just need to be more open to things that are happening around the fringes of science, right? And a lot of the theories of consciousness, especially ones involving inanimate objects having consciousness and so on, right? We should investigate them seriously.
Well, we need to. That's the most interesting thing that's popped up in the last year. It went from this arcane philosophical theory about like whether machines can have consciousness to being like, shit, do machines have consciousness? Like,
yeah,
and it's go for
yeah. Oh, it's funny. I mean, a lot of scientists trash philosophy and philosophers, and I think with consciousness and AI, it's philosophers' way of getting back at scientists and saying, "Hey, take that! You can't ignore us."
Real. So yeah, and I personally don't believe that they're conscious. I'd be curious whether you believe that they're conscious, and then how do we figure out whether these things are conscious? Because I think regulation, going back to regulation, I think we're going to have regulatory capture. We're going to have attempts at regulatory capture from the big LLM providers to make it conscious. This may be a conspiracy theory, but but like to say that it's conscious in order to regulate it according to a corporate body, something like that, basically.
Yeah, I think that's going to be hard. I mean, my feeling is that any attempt to regulate LLMs or any other kind of AI based on declaring it to be conscious is not going to be based on rational technical parameters, right? It's going to be more based on just what people think and a bunch of opinions. The government will probably appoint a body of experts who will tell them that, right? So because there's really no way of objectively determining that, right? But I always joke that when the Supreme Court said that corporations can be people, what's stopping them from saying that LLMs can be people?
yeah. That's exactly what I believe they're going to do. Okay, how do you explore the fringes of science? I would love to explore the fringes of science. How would I go about doing that?
Well, I think the first thing is to just take the fringes of science seriously enough, right? I think especially on Twitter and social media, we get into a lot of knee-jerk reactions, and that's something that I don't like. People tend to either embrace something wholeheartedly, dismiss something wholeheartedly right away. And I think we just need to spend some time saying, hey, this is interesting. Could there be any truth to this, right? It's that balance between the right amount of skepticism and being open-minded, right? So I think that's number one. And I actually think that we need better statistical techniques. Mm-hmm. And my feeling is that AI could probably help us in teasing apart these low fidelity signals, mm-hmm. these kind of N of ones and N of twos that don't conform to mm-hmm. the larger signal. And then, kind of isolate that, most of the times we'll dismiss that signal as noise, but it's actually not noise. It's just smaller signal. And so isolate that smaller signal and then take a look at it, see how you can amplify it and study it better, right? But I think there needs to be, again, we were talking about a psychological adjustment. There needs to be like a concerted psychological adjustment to enable us to do this well.
Brilliant. Can you go into what you mean by N of ones and N of twos? I understand that it's a way of referring to like a large number set. Is that what it is?
Well, I mean, I'm just referring to outliers, really. So data points that kind of buck the trend.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, just outliers.
If you have a N of 1,000, then or N of 2,000, then it's statistically significant. But if you have N of 1 or 2, then it's not.
It's not. But what I'm saying is that even in that N of 1,000, the N of 1,000 would still have that N of 1 or 2. They would still be members of that sample, those data points. But typically you would dismiss them because they don't lie on a straight line. They don't fit the plot, right?
Can AI help with this? How is AI changing science?
Well, so here's the thing, right? Again, this could be a bigger conversation, but this is something I like to talk about, which is that the problem with AI right now is that you need large amounts of training data. We all know that. And so AI is really good at identifying the signal, the general trend, right? The rules. And what we need we kind of need an anti-AI, if you will, which is much better at recognizing the exceptions rather than the rules, right? Because that's what I'm thinking about here. The stuff that does not fit the trend, we really need to isolate that as part of the signal effectively.
That's interesting. I'm going to go research that question of who is working on that.
And by the way, it's not that we don't do this, because in medicine, for instance, you always one famous example is there was this drug for heart disease that actually came out of a clinical trial in which they found this one woman in Texas who was like an aerobics instructor or yoga instructor, something like that. And she was like the healthiest person you can imagine, right? Like she was dieting, eating her vegetables and fruits and exercising every day. But somehow her cholesterol levels were through the roof. And so she was an outlier, right? She did not fit the trend. She did not fit the rule. So what was happening there? And they discovered this mutation in an enzyme that regulates cholesterol. And they found out that if you can target that enzyme, if you can block that enzyme, you can actually reduce cholesterol. So she was an outlier. She was an N of 1. And
she solved some problem. This is so great because there's so many examples like that in the semiconductor story as well, and also in the ivermectin story. The fact that it was just some random, the ivermectin was some random like algae and that grew in a golf club in Tokyo that the scientists found, like, and turns out it's like the one thing that covers river blindness in Africa.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And so. Yeah, go for it.
There's a company that's actually founded on this principle. I forget the name. I can send it to you later. But they are trying to identify individuals like this woman who are kind of complete outliers who have unusual abilities. I think the first time they pitched themselves, they're like, we are trying to find the X-men and X-women around us, right? Because they have these unusual abilities, some kind of physiological feature that's completely different from the population. And again, which would not necessarily be identified in a regular clinical trial, a standardized trial, because you're not looking for these outliers there.
Yeah,
much.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll go about 5 minutes more, maybe 10 more minutes more. So a lot of stuff we just talked about AI. What like, you don't have to go into the specifics of your company or anything like that, but what is your day job?
So my day job is to really do simulations of molecules interacting with each other. And the idea is to use the information from these simulations to improve the properties and qualities of molecules. Those molecules can be drugs, they can be molecules for defense applications, for agricultural applications. But what's important is understanding the physics of the interaction between these molecules. If you can simulate that physics well, then you could make some predictions about what molecules are better, what molecules are worse. And so it's a problem that a lot of people face, certainly in the pharmaceutical industry, but in all kinds of other industries.
And again, it goes to the outlier. So what tools are you using to do these simulations?
Well, so a lot of the tools really come from physics, because when you want to understand the interactions between molecules, you want to understand the quantum mechanics and the electrostatics and different forces that are responsible for that interaction, right? But I think in terms of technology, because those are tools as well, obviously, the cloud has completely revolutionized this kind of stuff, because the space of possibilities that you're trying to examine is stupendous. Because there's one calculation that tells you that the number of molecules that you can build with, let's say, 6 or 7 atoms like carbon and nitrogen is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. It's just a combinatorial problem, right? So it's something like 10 to the 60th or 10 to the 70th. That's the space of possibilities that you're dealing with. And now what you want to do is you want to explore as much of that space as possible and narrow it down to the few good examples, the few good outliers for that matter, which satisfy certain constraints. And the cloud has been phenomenal at doing this kind of work. I mean, it's worked, as we know now it's working really well for AIs, all those GPUs from NVIDIA and so on. But this is the classic combinatorial problem for which the cloud is exceptionally good.
So what specific cloud tool do you use? Is it Python, or like is it modeling software? I'm looking for startups to
Well,
enter.
I mean, my company develops we develop our own modeling software, but
Oh, okay.
we use AWS, we use the public cloud.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can use any other cloud that's available, because the whole idea is to be able to dynamically allocate cloud resources for your calculations, right? And that's something that's
That's what you guys build.
that's very much possible.
Yeah, cool. And okay, what are electrostatics?
So electrostatics are just, in simple terms, positive charges attract negative charges and they repel other positive charges, right? So when molecules interact with each other, some parts of them are positively charged, some parts of them are negatively charged. So obviously, think of it as a key and a lock. If the key is positively charged, the lock is negatively charged, it's going to really fit well, right? And those are the kinds of possible combinations that you want to identify among the, hundreds of billions of combinations that are around effectively.
Brilliant. And so we're dealing with molecules, and molecules are conglomerations of atoms, electrons, anything else? Protons?
That's basically it. Yeah, I mean, and in chemistry, it's all electrons, right? So in nuclear physics, it's the protons and neutrons that participate in the nuclear reactions.
Oh.
But what we are talking about is all chemistry. So it's all to do with the electrons. Nothing changes.
That's how they bond.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. That's really good. Another failure in my education may have something to do with me was mathematics and chemistry. Those were the two things I gave up very, very early, and I wish I hadn't given up so early on them. So chemistry, we've got molecules, and that leads to biology. But nanotech, let's go into nanotech. Are you familiar with what's going on with nanotech?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I think the big goal there is to really make self-reproducing machines, right? That's self-replicating automata, as they were called. And I mean, this is quite a part. I mean, I'm talking about the big goal there. I'm not saying that's the only goal. Obviously, material science, making better materials for solar technologies, nuclear technologies, making better polymers and plastics, that's all part of nanotech. But I think there's two things that, if you ask me what excites me about nanotech, it's really two things. One is drug delivery, which is very interesting. A lot of drugs, they don't work because you just can't put them in a bottle and, in a pill and take them effectively, because they break down in your body right away once you do that. So they just can't get to the liver or any other kind of organ that they need to get to. So what nanotechnology is helping us is package those drugs inside nanoparticles, little kind of molecular packages. And those molecular packages will get them to it's like a cargo delivery mechanism. The cargo will get to wherever it wants, wherever you intend it to be. And it also won't break down. You make it more stable so that it goes into your stomach, it gets absorbed, it goes past your liver, into your bloodstream. It's very stable. It doesn't get broken down. So that's a very exciting aspect of nanotech. If you are not familiar with this work, I would ask you to look at Robert Langer. He's at MIT. He runs the world's biggest biomedical engineering lab, but he's kind of an expert in this. So you'll find a lot of information on drug delivery. So that's one thing. But I think, speaking of more far out possibilities, I think the real exciting possibilities to have these self-replicating automata, sometimes
Mm.
called von Neumann probes, because John von Neumann came up with that idea. And this is something that I've even seen in a dream a couple of times, which is armies of robots spreading across the galaxy and the universe, each one replicating itself every couple of minutes, and then sending back information from all kinds of planets and galaxies and black holes and neutron stars,
Oh,
and using only the materials that they encounter in stars or asteroids or comets to replicate themselves. That's self.
whoa. So, but if that were possible, wouldn't that already have happened? Because there would be an extraterrestrial who did that?
Well, it could have happened, but just because the
Oh, we
universe
may
is so
not know it because it's so
still,
big.
yeah, we just don't know it. It's still, yeah, but that's funny. I mean, there could be
Just
a
hasn't
large,
landed here. It hasn't landed
yeah,
here
exactly. There
yet.
could be a giant cloud of von Neumann probes, like just waiting to get to Earth.
Whoa. Okay, so for our next episode, if you want to do on that's what we can talk about. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where do you write about science? Where can people find out about you?
Yeah, so obviously I'm on Twitter, as you know, and I think the main source of my writing right now is Three Quarks Daily, the blog. That's it's a very good website. It's yeah, Three Quarks, quark as in the quark in an atom. So Three Quarks Daily is the place where I write about science on a monthly. I have a monthly column there, so I write only once a month.
Great.
And then yeah, anyone who Googles for the curious wave function, they'll discover my regular blog, which I should update more often. I don't often update it as much as I should, but yeah, those are the two places really.
Curious wave function. I love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was great. No, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me, Stuart.